What did you think about that, Laura?
What do you think I thought about that, Kevin?
What are your feelings about police coercion, Laura?
I was crazed.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On, the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And this week, he spent 2 decades in a Canadian prison for a crime he didn't commit. So if Glen Assoun didn't murder Brenda Way, was it the serial killer who lived near the crime scene? We'll talk about the case and then give our thumbs up or thumbs down review to the CBC podcast, Uncover Dead Wrong. Joining me to get that done is my true crime co-author and real-life husband, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Of course, you're also a former TV journalist. We should tell people that, right?
That's right. And you should also see what I added there. I'm the one with the wisecracks.
You are the one with the wisecracks.
Yeah.
That's your thing.
That's my thing.
Doing some character development in this podcast.
Yeah. Well, we've had to make some adjustments to the script.
Yes. Why is that?
Well, we'll find out in a minute. So it's my reminder. Read the script.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, licensed private investigator, certified defense investigator, and certified cat lady, the one most likely to get enraged by injustice, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Hello, Rebecca. Yeah, I had to add rage yoga into my schedule this weekend to handle the rage I was feeling.
Know.
Yes.
Good to know. That's a good way to channel that Karen energy, Laura. I'm really proud of you.
It is. I learned the lion breath. That's a really good way to get the rage out, Rebecca.
Oh, wow.
And finally, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, host of the Strange Arrivals podcast, and our resident Doubting Thomas, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
Now, we should say we are videotaping this podcast. It's very exciting. Videotape probably isn't the right word anymore.
Filming.
So
have to explain why.
I know. Kevin, would you like to explain why?
We want to introduce our two audiences together. For those of you listening to the podcast, you should know we are now a Facebook Watch show.
It's unbelievable.
It's a TV show on Facebook Watch. You've heard of Facebook, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of popular. It's going around. And so you'll be able to watch the next 10 episodes of Crime Writers On. We're going to be doing a companion with Facebook Watch, and we're very excited about the opportunity. So now we have to say hello to our new Facebook Watch audience.
Hello. Facebook Watch audience.
And explain who we are, because they're coming to the party a little late.
Who are we? We are 4 journalists, authors, true crime writers. We all live in New Hampshire. We all got together a few years ago when Serial first came out and started a companion podcast to Serial called Crime Writers On Serial. And then for the last few years, we've been reviewing all sorts of other podcasts, TV shows, true crime stuff, pretty much anything in pop culture that is true crime and true crime adjacent.
Yeah, so we're really excited about your opportunity to get to know us. And of course, the great thing about Facebook Watch is that we can comment and discuss right on the page.
That's right.
You know, you're getting to do that interaction on Facebook, which is right where you're watching this show anyway. So that's really great.
Should we go ahead and start this week's review?
You should.
Sure.
Yes.
Let's get it done. Leading off. In 1995, the body of sex worker Brenda Way was discovered behind an apartment in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with her throat slashed. One suspect was Brenda's violent ex-boyfriend, Glen Assoun. His alibi was solid, and the case went cold until investigators put together a prosecution with no forensics and evidence derived from jailhouse informants and psychics. After more than 20 years behind bars, Glen Assoun's wrongful conviction was overturned. But if Brenda's killer wasn't Glen, could it have been the serial killer living just a block away? That's right. We're talking about Season 7 of the CBC True Crime podcast, Uncover Dead Wrong. Laura Bricker.
Yes.
We have a lot to talk about this case, but I also know that you and I share feelings about the Canadian style of true crime podcasting.
Yes.
What are your feelings about Uncover, and does or does it not fit into that mold of sort of the more take your time storytelling style that our Canadian friends have become known for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the first thing you'll notice about this podcast is that you're not going to start right off with a lot of action. It's really going along with this journalist and this reporter in this very slow and steady, sort of methodical, what I've come to think of as like the Canadian storytelling method in podcasts based on some of the others that we have listened to and reviewed over the years. And they really also, I think, do a lot of like how the sausage is made in these type of podcasts. So instead of just, going to an interview with somebody that they've gone and talked to, we're going to hear how they got the interview. Was it hard to get the interview? How long it took to get the interview? We might hear them going, like driving to the interview. So you definitely get a lot of the kind of behind the scenes, what goes into, investigating something as a journalist, but also producing a podcast like this. But, you have to stick with it. And that's the thing, as I had to keep reminding myself, is, okay, this is the way this story is, and it will build to a point where there is more action, but it's not going to be right out the gate.
Yeah, it's not going to exactly be like watching a thriller,
yes,
a film or something like that. Now, Kevin, Glen Assoun is our central character.
Yeah.
We start with him right at the beginning. Our reporter, Tim Bousquet, is in a hotel room with him, kind of getting ready to go to court. So we get to know Glen immediately, and a lot of the story is told through his point of view. But he's a complicated character, right? Like, people describe him in the podcast as difficult. Other people describe him as exactly what you would expect a wrongfully convicted person to be. What do you think of Glen as sort of a central figure in this, as a guy who was wrongly convicted of this killing?
Well, he's a problematic character because the reason he was a suspect is he had been Brenda Way's boyfriend, and they had a fairly abusive relationship from the sound of it. So in any other circumstance, this is like not the kind of guy that anybody would be sending flowers to. But we know right off the bat that he is this, victim of a wrongful conviction. So, I think that means that we're going to be like a little conflicted about this guy, but primarily, we already know that he didn't do it going into it. So I think that takes some of the sting out of it. Yeah.
What do you think, Toby, when you have someone like Glen, who the podcast tells us right at the beginning was wrongfully convicted? And so we know that the story here is how did that happen, but also maybe who is the real killer, what really happened. Like, they're really digging into this. But when you have a complicated, protagonist, like we do in Glen, hearing about things that he did in his life and ways that he lived, how do you feel about rooting for a guy like this?
Well, I don't know how much like rooting for him is actually the right word, because I think you can feel badly for his situation in that he ends up, he's got a little bit of a record. I think they say that he has a 6th grade education, and once he goes to trial and he's his own defense attorney with predictable results, right? He doesn't know what he's doing. He's trying his best, but there are things he wants to get across because he knows he's innocent, that he wants to get across to the jury. He just doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know the rules of the courtroom. So you can sort of sense his frustration and panic that he doesn't know how to get this information across. So, you feel sympathy for that. And then I get, the more you hear about his time actually in prison and apparently how he brought, abuse upon himself just by maintaining his innocence, but really horrific, torturous abuse on the part of guards. It's hard for me to actually root for him, but to understand that he is not only a victim of injustice, but of a system that seemed to work in a way that was unfair, and the punishment that he received, particularly for something he didn't do, was so beyond what American prisons are supposed to be like. I know that they are that way, but sort of this idea of cruel and unusual punishment is certainly the case in the experiences that he relates when he talks about his prison experience.
Kevin, we hear a lot about the police investigation in this case and other actors in the investigation. Later, when we hear from the Innocence Project people, the equivalent of the Innocence Project people in Canada, they're like, there were 5 witnesses, which seems like kind of a slam dunk case. And then we start hearing about what some of these witnesses have going on. One of them is Brenda's sister, right? She talks to a psychic and then is told there's going to be a knife near the crime scene, and then finds a knife near the crime scene.
This was a year later.
Right.
This is what we have to let people remember, is that the case went cold.
Right.
Brenda Way was a prostitute in Halifax.
Sex worker.
Sorry, you're a sex worker in Halifax.
Listen, they refer to her as a prostitute a lot in the podcast, not the host, but people talking sort of about the case. We hear it all the time. We hear it in the news clips. We hear, but clearly we want to go with our preferred term, which is sex worker.
Okay. And so Brenda was killed, and there wasn't any really good leads, right? So people were looking at Glen because he did have the relationship, which was volatile. But he had an alibi. He had been at somebody else's house. It was pretty solid. There's no forensic evidence. And so it pretty much went stagnant. But then as, some people who were sort of around Glen and around Brenda started talking to one another, these things all of a sudden started coming out of the woodwork.
Right.
The craziest one, I think, though, is definitely the knife. That the sister had talked to, had some psychic vision, or somebody had a
she talked to a psychic at a party,
right?
And it was like your sister was murdered with a knife with a
broken tip. Yeah.
Surprise!
And they found that she finds the knife
right
a year later, a couple of 100 yards, or not even that, like very close to the actual crime scene, that no police officer saw.
Right. Or
dogs picked up.
Yeah. So. But they also couldn't connect that knife as the murder weapon.
That's
so
right.
why that was presented as anything is crazy.
Right.
I don't know why they would do that. That's nuts.
But Laura, this isn't the only time we hear that psychics are involved in this investigation, and that the investigator who ends up taking this over, McDonald, no relation to the nice lawyer McDonald we hear from later, is somebody that liked working with psychics to help solve cases. What do you think of that as an investigative technique, former defense investigator Laura Bricker?
Well, I think, there are all levels of psychics. And I have a good friend who actually is a legitimate psychic. But I don't think that this should be your only investigative tool. It's like lie detectors, in a way. So I think that going into an investigation, there's much more traditional ways to track down witnesses and to track down leads. And in some cases, you might get a little bit of information from adding on some side help. But in this case, they were going to sort of like what you call like the circus sideshow psychics. They weren't going to the legitimate psychics. Are there legitimate psychics?
We're not going to fight with Laura, but whether or not they're legit. Laura does a podcast with psychics.
I'm on a podcast about psychics.
But I mean, they're like police certified psychics.
Listen, we're not going to win this battle today.
No, but I can think about cases like where I live here in Exeter, New Hampshire. We have a very, in our town, sort of famous missing child case. And there's a little girl who disappeared back in 1984. And at one point, they consulted with a psychic in that case who gave them, I thought, probably not really credible information. And they drained a pond because that was, what the psychic told them to do. So
it's always near water.
I know. So I'm done with talking about the psychic.
How about we just let Toby weigh in? Toby, how would you feel if, you were working on an investigation and then it was taken over by another cop who decided to put together a bunch of information, much of which came from psychic tips that also seemed to coincide with witnesses knowing one another and perhaps telling each other things?
I think I would shake my head sadly. Yeah, this whole it's pretty. I think some of the decisions that were made here are definitely in hindsight don't look very good, and the fact that he's innocent. So I don't know whether you would call it like officially a frame up, but I think they did fall into the trap that we've seen in a lot of other true crime shows and podcasts, which is you identify your suspect and then you make the evidence fit that narrative rather than following the evidence where it leads. And one of the kind of surprising bits is when Glenn finally does get sort of competent legal representation, and they find that there's this whole list of other possible suspects, and they're not like sort of random people who might have done it. I mean, they're people who, there's good reason to believe based on their past and based on lack of alibis or actions that night, could very well be the killer.
Well, how about based on their future?
Right.
Where the guy living across the street or around the corner
is a serial killer.
Is an actual serial killer.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, I do want to talk about that because that kind of comes to Roberta, who's the main witness in this case against Glenn. She's a young sex worker. She tells a harrowing story to the police of being kidnapped and sexually assaulted, and, never reports it because she, has an outstanding warrant. But then years later, she says she was watching after the arrest of Glen Assoun for this crime, and she was like, oh, that's the man who attacked me, because she remembers the man who attacked her saying that he killed Pitbull, which was, of course, Brenda's nickname. So that's the story we get initially, and it's very credible, and it sort of is like, but they just said that Glenn was wrongfully convicted. But then later we find out, Laura, that the police coerced her into saying it was Glenn, because they were going to arrest her for other sort of outstanding stuff over her head. What did you think of that whole Brenda storyline? Here's a real victim who was used by the cops to convict the wrong man.
Yeah.
What did you think about that, Laura?
What do you think I thought about that, Kevin?
What are your feelings about police coercion, Laura?
I was crazed.
Laura loves a good coercion.
Oh my gosh. Well, because I was listening to this, and this is where, I was talking about the story builds in this, and this is where it I almost knocked my microphone. This is where it reached a point where she's talking about how they kept bringing her in. They are talking about, you need to, identify this person. We know you can identify this person. And she is feeling just eventually, sounds like desperate. So she's like, it was Glenn. It must have been Glenn, because, she remembers that the person that attacked her, it was the person who had killed Brenda. And that's what the person said when they were done attacking her. But what I loved was the Innocence Project people from Canada. I can't remember. They're not called Innocence Project. They're called like Canadian
Innocence Canada.
Innocence Canada. And I loved when they were talking to her about the description of, because there was this weird thing where he was wearing sandals. The man that attacked her was wearing sandals.
Sandals and socks.
But it was the wrong time of year for that. It didn't make sense. So she saw his legs. They were hairy, all that stuff. And then this is a big spoiler. I don't know if I should reveal this, but I won't. Basically, based on that description, it became very clear that it was not Glenn that was her attacker. And it also became very clear that she had never looked at pictures of anybody else that might have been a suspect. Because when they showed her pictures of somebody that was a legitimate suspect, she's like, oh yeah, that's him. And I'm like, I was going to say, are you bleeping kidding me? That's what I would say.
Laura, her attacker gave her his address.
Yeah, he lived like one block over.
She told the police, he lives on Jackson Street, or he told me he lived on Jackson Street. This guy, the serial killer guy, lived on Jackson Street. It's that guy. I mean, it's definitely that guy.
It's crazy.
Allegedly. It's my opinion.
Well,
it's definitely that guy.
It's my opinion too. And it just, yeah. So that was definitely, and I think early on in the podcast, I didn't really have a sense of exactly what the injustice was that led to the wrongful conviction, or what the overwhelming evidence was that he was innocent, because we knew that that's where this podcast was going. When you hear that bit of information, it's like, oh, bingo. Okay, this is a mess. And, So that was...
It gets worse.
It gets worse. Yeah.
It gets worse. We're going to find out in subsequent episodes that there was information withheld by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that they never turned over.
Yes.
And we do find out in the end the reason to let him go is because the serial killer probably did it.
Toby, I have a question for you.
Okay.
We hear a protracted trial sequence. And one of the reasons I think we hear it on the podcast is because Glen is representing himself at trial. There are a series of events that have to do with him firing his attorney and then not really listening to the judge when she said, if you show up at this hearing, you don't have an attorney, we're still going to go forward. So he ends up defending himself. And there are some moments that we hear in this trial tape where it's like, good for you, Glen. Nice try, buddy. Right? But nice try, buddy. Doesn't work when there are also rules such as, things have to be in evidence in order for you to talk about them in court. And, when you question witnesses, you have to do it in a certain way. And, the sort of just procedures of, being a defender, Glen didn't know anything about that stuff. What did you think about the fact that this man was convicted of this crime? In addition to having all these witnesses who all knew each other, which he, by the way, did uncover in court, after representing himself. I mean, wouldn't you think that alone should lead to his conviction being overturned?
Well, if you have the right to defend yourself, I don't see how you can then just say, well, there clearly wasn't a fair trial since I defended myself. I mean, that seems like I think that's a tough argument to make, although I think it is easy to go through and see that he's really just incapable of doing it. I think there are probably some people who can, I don't think it would be rare to find somebody who can defend themselves as well as an actual lawyer who they hire, even if they are a lawyer themselves. You don't want to represent yourself in those situations.
It happens in Law and Order all the time, Toby.
It does.
Just FYI.
Damn. I should have known.
Some serial killer will get up and just be great, and Jack McCoy will be super scared.
Ted Bundy made that the plot of 100 television episodes. But what I was going to say was, so he and sometimes it just kind of reminded me of when I would referee basketball games when Jake was 6 or 7. And
Jake, your son?
Yeah, my son. I'm sorry. Yeah, Jake, my son, was 6 or 7, and the kids just didn't know the rules. So most of reffing was kind of explaining to kids, when you do that, you kind of have to dribble. And it seemed like, and that was kind of what the judge was saying is you can't, you can ask that question, you just can't ask it the way you asked it.
Right. And he's learning on the fly, which doesn't help. Laura, we do hear some defense investigators in this podcast.
Yes.
Fred Fitzsimmons.
Yes.
Very outspoken, strong advocate for Glen for a while. Reminded me a lot of you. And he basically says at one point about Glen, just because you're an doesn't mean you're convicted for murder. It doesn't mean you should be convicted for murder. Talk about whether or not that rings true for you. Did you ever do defense work for clients that you just found to be very difficult?
Oh, all the time. And that's something we've talked about a lot on our podcast over the years, with the Stephen Avery case, where it was okay, clearly there's some issues going on here, but that doesn't mean that he got a fair trial. And I think that's why I loved this defense investigator, because that's the thing is you're not there because you're best friends with this client. You're there to keep the system fair, and you're there to make sure that they get a thorough and vigorous defense, and that all the angles are covered, and that the witnesses are talked to, and that, that they have the same access to investigation that the prosecutors have. And there are lots of times where I remember having clients that were argumentative, that were demeaning, that were not nice to us, that, but you know what? They might have still had legitimate points in their case. And so that's, I think, one of the things you have to look at when you're doing defense work, because a lot of times, like Toby was saying, this guy is angry because he knows that he's innocent. And it doesn't sound like he was the nicest individual before that. But then that just sort of heightened all these personality traits that he might have had before that made him difficult to be around. But I always love when we hear from the defense investigators because, that
they're your people.
Yeah, they are. And they're doing good work and they're out there. And a lot of times they are finding things that weren't found when, police maybe were busy and didn't have time to do, follow up leads if they felt like they already had their man.
By the way, did anybody else have root talk on their bingo card?
Did you have root talk on your bingo card?
I did not. I should have.
Crab crib.
Talk about why root talk should have been on your bingo card for this podcast.
There was a scene where the host, Tim, got in a car with somebody and they drove somewhere. I forget, someplace important.
Well, I actually think you're pointing to some of the flaws of the storytelling of this podcast, which we would be remiss, I think, or I would feel remiss if I didn't say I found this podcast incredibly difficult to follow.
Yeah.
In many, many, many parts. For exactly what you point out. I even have a list here of characters and what happened.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait. And it literally says, oh, look, the pimp, Bobby Renner. I'm like, okay, who was the pimp? What scene was he in? Am I the only one, Kevin?
No.
Did you have any hard time following the story of this podcast?
Well, I supplemented my knowledge with...
So no, you don't care.
Yeah.
What about you, Laura?
I
Did
did.
you find this podcast difficult to follow points?
I did. And I will say that episode 3 was for me the hardest episode to follow. That was the courtroom episode where, the host told us that he had access to these, it was thousands of hours of courtroom tape. And then we heard about how journalists could record the courtroom
and then
tape.
it felt like we heard thousands of hours.
And
of
it did. And I felt like just because
That's
you
the
have
problem.
thousands of hours of tape doesn't mean we need to hear thousands of hours of tape. And I felt like that for me was where when you have big blocks of somebody talking like that's recorded, that's not broken up with some writing and some transitions and some framing, then for me, it all just starts to blend together after a while. So that was where it started. It was definitely, there were times where I felt like I wanted some more signposting as to what was going on because...
And you know what,
it was,
Laura, also, I feel like that... when reporters sometimes have big blocks of research,
yes,
they fall in love with that research.
Yes.
And so
that's happened to you.
It happened to me. Yeah.
Me too.
It's happened to me.
Our editor is like, why is this in your book? This is not interesting.
So I feel
Nobody cares what kind of car the serial killer drove, Kevin.
Yeah.
Oh, I do.
But I like the court scene, but I think it probably could have been a little shorter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we get to our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews, if you want to hear an expanded discussion of us talking about this case and podcast, plus a bonus review of the AMC Game Show Swindle miniseries quiz, subscribe to the Crime Writers On podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can like and follow us here on Facebook and Instagram. Tell us your review of Uncover Dead Wrong in the comments, and you can join the amazing community in our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. And for exclusive podcasts and more, of course, join us at patreon.com/partners in crime media. Laura Bricker, I'm going to come to you first.
Yes.
Would you recommend to our viewers and our listeners that they check out Uncover Dead Wrong? This is the latest season in Uncover, the true crime series from CBC Podcast. What do you think, Laura Bricker?
So I would say if you are okay with a podcast that is a little slower paced, but also if you love lots of details about crimes and you really want to know everything that happened, how the sausage was made behind the scenes, and lots of detailed information, this is a type of podcast that you would like. So I didn't love it. As much as I've loved some other ones, but it was a really interesting case. So I would say thumbs up. I always find it interesting when we listen to something that kind of gives us a window into the criminal justice system in other parts of the world. And I thought it was really interesting hearing about Nova Scotia and how crime and punishment is handled there.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Uncover Dead Wrong from CBC Podcasts?
Yeah, well, we talked about the pacing. One of the things that I think that the slower pace really lets them do well is to sort of paint a picture of the community in which this occurs. You learn a lot about the lives of the people who are both victims and potential perpetrators. And that's, kind of a hallmark of a lot of good Canadian true crime podcasts. I liked it quite a bit. I give it an enthusiastic thumbs up. I didn't have a hard time with the pacing. I do agree that I think the third episode, which is the episode with a lot of court tape, it needed to be broken up a little bit. There needed to be, like we said, signposting, just something. I mean, you can kind of get lulled by just listening to court tapes, or at least I can. But in general, I thought it was pretty good.
Kevin Flynn, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Uncover Dead Wrong from CBC Podcasts?
I'm a thumbs up, not an enthusiastic thumbs up. It's a perfectly serviceable podcast. CBC is really great at doing Uncover. But this is the first Uncover that actually feels like a true crime story. A lot of times, like with Escaping Nexium or The Village, it was really a crime story, but underneath it was just sort of crime wrapped around a story about a bigger societal issue. This could be a little more about the whole, wrongful conviction thing in general, but it's not. It seems to be just focused on this one particular case. Find it's not got a lot of flash. It's, again, a perfectly serviceable CBC podcast. So I give it a thumbs up.
So I really wanted to like this podcast. I think the case is super interesting. I think the wrongful conviction of Glen Assoun. I think the murder of Brenda. I think a lot of the stories we hear from her family and friends, and I think a lot of the courtroom stuff and the procedural stuff is really interesting. I can't give the podcast a thumbs up. I'm sorry. I found it too difficult to follow. I didn't think that Tim, the host, and the writing of the podcast did enough reminding us who people were without referring to a scene that we didn't remember. He would be like, remember, so-and-so is the person who did X. And I would be like, no, I don't remember that, because that was not a very memorable scene. I do think that just the linear nature of the storytelling could have been straighter. It tried to be linear, but it didn't quite work in a linear way. So for me, as much as I love Uncover as a series, and I love my friends at CBC Podcasts, I cannot give Dead Wrong a thumbs up. Interesting case, though. Super interesting case.
So what is it then?
Thumbs down.
Okay.
Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of the week. Seems like Arby's doesn't have the meats. Police in Buffalo say someone broke into the Arby's by Niagara Falls and stole $1,500 worth of frozen food. This is the breakdown. 7 cases of roast beef, 5 cases of corned beef, 2 cases of turkey, and 2 cases of curly fries. Investigators believe employees simply forgot to lock everything when the restaurant closed for the night. We know the Hamburglar doesn't go for roast beef, so the suspect pool has been sliced thin. Panel, here's my question for you, Laura Bricker. Someone got themselves several weeks worth of Arby's goodness. If you could ransack the kitchen of any restaurant, which one would it be?
Well, I am high in my comfort food mode right now in this ongoing life at home during the pandemic. So I would break into the Lexi's burger restaurant here in Exeter, because I am addicted to their truffle fries and the truffle salt. And they also have everything else like milkshakes. I could go for that. So I could be set for a long time with burgers, milkshake, and truffle fries.
Okay. What about you, Toby? Well, I like Laura's answer, supporting local business, even in this podcast.
That's what I do.
Why
stealing from local business.
You know why I don't like her answer? Is because that was going to be my answer, except I was going to be doing the one at the Newington Yacht Club. That's
a nice
right
one, isn't it?
Yeah, same restaurant, Lexi's?
Yeah,
it's Lex. I think there's maybe 4 of them. Yeah. I mean, it's got really good burgers, and the shakes are awesome, and the fries.
The truffle fries,
just really
Toby.
Good. Truffle fries.
I gotta tell you, I've never heard Toby, the word yacht club come out of Toby's mouth.
Well, it's not.
I think people need to understand it's not fancy.
It's a marina.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
it's a marina with picnic tables out front.
There's a lot
there ain't no yachts at the Newington Yacht Club.
There's a lot of boats that are that are all wrapped up right now.
Yeah.
Dry storage, yes.
Yeah,
that's where our boat sank a few years ago.
It's good for
our boat sank.
It's a good place for socially distant dining, though, because it's just all these these picnic tables that are all spread out.
Nice.
So
nice. But you would steal the food, not the picnic table, to be clear.
Well, I guess it just depends.
All right, Kevin. Someone got themselves several weeks worth of Arby's goodness. If you could ransack the kitchen at any restaurant, which restaurant would it be?
Oh, it's got to be Dunkin' Donuts.
I knew it.
Yeah.
Because I don't have to heat up any of that stuff. I can just put it in boxes and I'd be good for a week.
Little box of 40 jelly-filled munchkins for you.
Exactly.
I hate to say it, it's not my favorite restaurant, but it is my favorite fast food restaurant. Got to go with the Taco Bell. You know I do.
Oh, my God.
Sorry, guys. I love me a bean burrito. I was on the road today. Picked one up today. It was delicious.
I can tell.
Studio B for Bean Burrito.
Bean Burrito.
All right, that's going to do it for us. Remember to follow us right here on Facebook. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with another true crime review and case breakdown. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for watching. We will catch you later.